Often in these debates, Portugal also, usually comes up. In Portugal, they did decriminalize all drugs, but they did not legalize the production of marijuana. The second point and this is important, because the second point I want to make is that with legalization, you're going to see a large reduction in the production costs. There are several reasons for this, and a lot of it's based on risk. Right now, when someone buys marijuana or methamphetamine or cocaine, a lot of what they're doing is compensating the drug dealer and everyone else along that supply chain for the risk of arrest and risk of incarceration. That goes away with legalization. You also expect there to be economies of scale, advances in technology. So if marijuana was actually farmed like a normal agricultural good, the cost would just plummet. The California director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML, testified a couple years ago and said that if marijuana was legalized and unregulated, the cost could drop to a few dollars an ounce, pennies a joint. And this is actually consistent with some of the other work that we did looking at the California proposals. We would also expect a large price drop even if you had an alternative model where it was only legal to grow in grow houses. As part of RAND's 2010 Alter State report, John Calkins and a number of colleagues actually estimated what it would cost to build a grow house and in terms of what types of yields you would get. And the bottom line is that if a state were to legalize and in-house production was allowed, you would see the production cost per pound could fall to somewhere around $400. Then once you throw in retailer markup, logistics, and distribution, the pre-tax price for an ounce could actually, this is for Sensimilla high-quality indoor grow marijuana, could drop below $50. Now right now in California and a lot of country, an ounce of kind of the same quality marijuana goes for about $250 to $350 an ounce. So that's a really large price drop, a large drop focusing on the pre-tax prices. And finally, we also have insights about production costs from other countries with medical marijuana programs. So Dale Geringer, the head of California NORML, just published an article talking about how in Israel, right now, when they for their medical marijuana program, it's outdoor, but it's still medical grade, high quality, it costs them about 79 cents a gram to produce, or about $22. And we also have $22 an ounce. And we also have information from the Netherlands. While I said that it's not legal to produce, there actually is one producer in the Netherlands that is actually producing marijuana for their medical program. I was just there about 6 months ago, and these are pictures of their veg and their flowering rooms. And right now they're only producing about 400 pounds a year. And this is pretty high quality, 19% THC, no pesticides, consistent product. But it's important to know that both of these rooms they have here are only about 600 square feet each. So they are hardly kind of along the economies of scale curve. But that said, they opened up their books to me, and if we look at what the marginal cost is for producing a gram of this high quality cannabis, it's only about €1. And this is in the Netherlands, and this is very small scale production. So putting this all together, we know that the production costs are going to fall, the pre-tax prices will be low. Of course, we can put taxes and we can put regulations on as a way of trying to increase the retail price to try to offset this drop. However, if the taxes are too large, you really do have to worry about tax evasion. Right now in California, the taxes on a pack of cigarettes, which are close to about an ounce, run about $2, federal plus state. And you have the State Board of Equalization has come out and said that 14% of all packs that are consumed in California are actually smuggled in. They've evaded the taxes. Now there is debate about this 14%, but it's important to note that just on $2 an ounce, you do have evasion. Now think about that grow house model that I was just talking about, where if the previous price was $250 an ounce, but now the pre-tax price would be $50, you would need $200 in taxes and in fees in order to try to get that up just for an ounce. And that's just not going to happen. We talk about this in the book, though. There is one model where we think it could do a decent job of artificially inflating the price, and that's if the regime is actually designed to collect revenue and enforce laws against those that are producing when they shouldn't be. But that would require a tightly enforced, government-controlled state monopoly. And it's unclear about whether or not that would actually be politically plausible in the United States. For example, if a state were to do that, whether or not the federal government would allow that. A lot of the other work we've been doing is also thinking about the design considerations. So if you're a state and you've already you've decided that you want to legalize, you have a lot of choices. And one of the big choices is going to come down to what the taxes are going to be. So a lot of the discussion is about taxes per gram, but it's important to note there are other options there. You could have an ad valorem tax, you could tax by the share of THC, which is the intoxicating ingredient. You could also tax by different ratios of different cannabinoids, percent, perhaps the share of THC to CBD. There are a lot of options there. And so it's important to realize that you don't just have to tax by weight if you're thinking seriously about these issues. The final point I want to make is that legalization not only reduces costs to the criminal justice system, it also reduces costs imposed by the criminal justice system. When someone gets arrested or convicted for marijuana possession, this can have a negative impact on them as well as their intimates. And we know that there are these collateral consequences where convictions can make it harder to obtain federal funding for student loans. It can make it harder to obtain or to get into public housing. But there's actually no evidence that any of those collateral consequences make a difference. So it's important to note that this is something that should be part of the debate. But honestly, it is hard to quantify. It's hard to come up with numbers for that to then just put it in a cost-benefit analysis. But this should be part of the discussion. On the other side, with respect to what the costs of marijuana prohibition are to the criminal justice system, the numbers are all over the place. When we started looking at this with respect to in California, there was one estimate that put out by NORML that said it was about $200 million a year. There was another estimate that said the California criminal justice system spends $2 billion a year enforcing the laws. And there's a big difference there. And so if you kind of take information about arrest, incarceration, adjudication, and you slap on some unit costs, you can get a pretty good idea about what the ballpark figure is. And our best estimate was that for California, they probably spend but this was actually before the Lenno Bill 2011, that spending was between $250 and $350 million per year. The final point I want to make, though, is while legalization would reduce some of the criminal justice costs, it's not going to eliminate them. Many of the marijuana legalization propositions would still keep it illegal for those who are under 21. However, John and I, for a different paper, we looked at the arrests broken down by age in California. And more than 40% of all marijuana arrests in California were for those who were still under 21. Now sure, some of those were for sales, and that would go away with legalization, but a lot of them were for possession too. So with that, those are kind of 4 general points, and now I want to hand it over to John to talk more specifically about the 2012 proposals. Thank you.
Thanks, Bo. So the first point about 2012 is legalization at the state level is a real possibility this year. 10 states considered 17 different proposals. 3, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, will vote on legalization this fall. Legalization has been a topic for 50 years. But what has changed is the probability of passage. General population surveys for the nation as a whole have support at 50% this past year. A poll 2 months ago had 56% yes and only 36% no. Polls on specific propositions will tend to be a little less favorable because someone might not like aspects of a particular proposal. The polls on the particular propositions are running just a little above 50% in Colorado and Washington and a bit below in Oregon. So none is guaranteed to pass, but it's a real possibility that one could. And if even one of these 3 passes, it will radically change marijuana markets throughout the entire United States. The second point I want to make is that these proposals are different. It's very common in this topic to think of marijuana legalization as a binary choice. Yes, no, do I favor it or not? But there's a lot of variation between different legalization proposals. For example, the 17 proposals split roughly equally across these 3 bins: repeal only, repeal and delegate, repeal and regulate. Repeal only is just what it says. All it does is repeal all laws against marijuana-related activity, or maybe everything except driving under the influence. And these can be short. Michigan's was just 88 words long. And you might say, well, that doesn't change anything because the Federal Controlled Substances Act would still be out there. And that's true. So any marijuana activity, even a single medical patient with 1 joint, could still be arrested. But the key thing to realize is that 97% of all marijuana arrests are made by state and local enforcement. So state legalization removes the great bulk of the arrests. And there is precedent for this. In 1923, New York State repealed its alcohol prohibition a full decade before the nation repealed the Volstead Act. But none of the three are in that bin. Oregon's is in the repeal and delegate, which repeals all the prohibition laws and it sketches a framework for a regulatory regime, but delegates the fleshing out of that to some state agency. In that case, it would be a newly constituted Oregon Cannabis Commission. Washington and Colorado are in the repeal and regulate. Now, there's still going to be an agency, Colorado Department of Revenue, Washington Liquor Control Board, but the proposition itself spells out in great detail what would happen. So Oregon's proposition, 1 page, Washington 502, 62 pages. So a big difference in the level of detail. Now, to give you just a little bit of a sense of what are in these propositions, Colorado and Washington are somewhat alike, so I'll talk about them together. They are both free enterprise approaches. The government would be only licensing and regulating. It would be licensed private companies that would do all the cultivation, processing, and sale. Both have ad valorem taxes as a percentage of value. So after prices plummet, effectively these taxes are fairly modest, so maybe there wouldn't be a huge problem with evasion. Colorado caps the tax at no more than 15% and only on non-medical. And that's a key distinction because 1/4 of Colorado's past month users have a medical recommendation. Washington's is more complicated. There's 3 different 25% levies at different market levels. Both would earmark some of the tax revenue for popular causes, perhaps as a way of making it politically awkward for the federal government to try to seize those tax revenues as the proceeds of illegal transactions. Both you might describe as good faith efforts to create a responsible regulatory regime. Washington in particular has a lot of provisions to try to make the retail distribution points relatively unobtrusive. Restrictions on advertising, signage, location, and so on. And the Oregon Cannabis Tax Act is completely different. This Oregon Cannabis Commission would participate directly in the trade. There would still be private contractors for production, but the sales would be through state stores, which, as Bo said, if it were at the national level, would have some important advantages. And there are other provisions that try to restrain the consequences. For instance, sanctions against selling to minors or public consumption. But there are also parts of the Oregon proposition which are aggressively pro-industry, and most conspicuously it builds in regulatory capture. This OCC, which would be responsible for restraining diversion from licensed cultivation into outright black markets, would by design be captured by the producers. 5 of the 7 commissioners would be picked by the producers. There's also no local opt-out. A town couldn't say, fine for the rest of the state, but we don't want to do it. And there are some really striking provisions about what the Attorney General would have to do, including being obligated to aggressively defend anyone who is prosecuted for any action that would be licensed under the Act.